The hot sun beat down mercilessly on the small, weathered farmhouse at the edge of town, casting long shadows across the dry, cracked soil. Inside, Eliza's hands trembled as she worked the coarse linen, trying to ignore the oppressive weight of the silence. Her mother had long since retreated to the garden, muttering prayers for forgiveness, leaving Eliza to face her father and brothers alone. They sat around the rough-hewn kitchen table, their expressions rigid, faces carved with the lines of disappointment and frustration. Eliza's heart pounded against her chest. She knew why she had been summoned. Her father, a man whose love had always been measured by duty and practicality, cleared his throat. "Eliza," he began, his voice tight, "we've discussed this before. You failed to provide what a woman in this family must." He glanced at her brothers, who nodded in grim agreement. "It's time we make arrangements. You will be married to Mr. Harding." The word struck her like a whip. "Married?" she whispered, her voice shaking. "But her eldest brother interrupted, his tone sharp, almost cruel. "Don't act surprised. You've been a disappointment long enough. Everyone in this town knows you cannot give the family an heir. Will not waste more time waiting for something that will never come." Eliza's mind spun. She had always known the whispers, the side glances at family gatherings, the polite smiles that never reached anyone's eyes when they spoke to her. She had tried to ignore it, to hope that love or purpose could shield her from their judgment. But now there was no escape. Her family had labeled her barren, as if her worth could be measured by a child she could not have. And now they were selling her off like property, not like a daughter, not like a human being with dreams or feelings. Tears threatened to fall, but she clenched her fists, determined not to give them the satisfaction. "You can't do this," she said, her voice barely audible. "I am your daughter." "You can't." Her father's expression hardened. "It's done. You are to leave at dawn. Mr. Harding will take you away. It's for the good of the family." There was no warmth in his eyes, only the cold efficiency of someone executing a duty. "Consider it an opportunity. Perhaps someone else will find value in what we cannot." Eliza sank into a chair, the weight of betrayal pressing down on her chest. Her mother, who had been silently weeping in the corner, came forward and tried to reach for her hand, but even her touch felt empty, powerless against the decree that had been set in stone. "I'm sorry, child," her mother whispered, but the words were hollow. Apologies could not undo what had been done. As night fell, Eliza packed the few belongings she could carry, each item a silent farewell to a life she had once imagined. Every stitch in her worn dresses, every ribbon in her hair, carried memories of a childhood that had now been stripped away. She felt anger, shame, and sorrow all at once, a storm that threatened to consume her. The walls of the farmhouse, which had always been her refuge, now felt like a prison closing in, a reminder that love in her family had always been conditional, tied to her ability to fulfill a role she had never been able to. By the time the first light of dawn crept across the horizon, Eliza stood at the gate, suitcase in hand, her back straight despite the turmoil inside her. She cast one last glance at the home she had known, the fields where she had played, and the family that had betrayed her. She did not look for pity. She did not expect comfort. All she felt was the burning determination to survive, to endure, and perhaps somewhere far beyond the reach of her father's judgment, to find a place where she would be valued, not for what she could give, but for who she was. As the carriage arrived, Eliza stepped forward, the sun glinting off the worn leather of the wheels. The doors opened, and she climbed in, leaving behind the only world she had ever known. Her family's voices, calling after her, faded into the distance, and for the first time, she faced a future that was entirely her own, terrifying, uncertain, but filled with a glimmer of hope she hadn't dared to feel in years. The carriage jolted over the uneven dirt road, each bump sending a shiver of unease through Eliza. The early morning air carried the scent of dry grass and dust, mingling with the faint, unplaceable smell of carriage leather and horses. She sat stiffly, her hands clasped tightly on her lap, her eyes fixed on the passing fields, trying to focus on the horizon rather than the sinking feeling in her chest. Every mile carried her farther from the only home she had ever known and closer to a life she had never chosen. Her mind wandered back to her father's cold words, echoing in the small confines of the carriage. "You are to leave at dawn. Mr. Harding will take you away. It's for the good of the family." The decree had been final, like a hammer striking metal, shaping the fate she had no power to alter. Eliza's heart ached with the injustice, but beneath that ache was something sharper, a quiet, stubborn ember of defiance. She would endure this journey, yes, but she would not let them define her. She would not allow herself to be broken. The driver, a silent man with sun-weathered skin, guided the horses with steady hands. He had spoken only once, warning her to keep still and not to make trouble. Eliza hadn't replied. She had no need for conversation with someone who regarded her as little more than cargo. She studied the rolling hills that stretched toward the horizon, noting the wildflowers that clung stubbornly to the dry soil, and the lone oak trees that stood like sentinels against the endless sky. In the beauty of the landscape, she found a small comfort, a reminder that the world extended beyond the confines of her father's judgment. Hours passed in silence, broken only by the occasional neigh of a horse or the creak of the carriage wheels. Eliza tried to imagine the ranch where she would soon arrive. She pictured endless fields, the smell of hay and livestock, and perhaps the faint promise of work that would give her a sense of purpose. But she also feared the unknown. What if the man she was being delivered to was cruel or indifferent, the kind who measured a woman's worth solely by her ability to bear children? She shivered at the thought and wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders. As the sun climbed higher, the carriage turned onto a narrow trail lined with dense pines. The shadows deepened, and the air cooled slightly, carrying with it the scent of pine resin and earth. It felt like stepping into another world, one untamed and unpredictable, unlike the rigid, judgmental town she had left behind. Eliza's thoughts flickered to the man who awaited her, Jacob, the widowed rancher. She knew little of him except that he had acquired the ranch through inheritance and hardship, that he was respected in the county, and that he was a man of few words. That alone gave her pause. Men of silence could be either compassionate or cruel. Her stomach tightened as the trail dipped into a valley, revealing the ranch in the distance. Its wooden fences stretched across sprawling fields, and the main house rose sturdy and proud against the backdrop of rolling hills. Smoke curled from the chimney, promising warmth and the faint scent of cooked meals. For the first time since leaving her home, Eliza felt a flicker of curiosity that rivaled her fear. What kind of man lived here? Would he see her only as property, or could he see something more, something real? The carriage slowed as it approached the ranch gates, and Eliza's heart thudded so loudly she feared it might betray her and narrowly hers. The carriage doors swung open with a reluctant groan, and Eliza stepped down onto the gravel path, her boots crunching softly against the stones. The ranch lay spread before her, larger and wilder than she had imagined from the distance. Fences stretched across fields of tall, swaying grass, and a line of horses grazed lazily under the morning sun. Birds circled high above, their calls echoing through the valley, and a gentle breeze carried the scents of hay, leather, and earth. For a moment, Eliza allowed herself to breathe, to take in the beauty and the freedom that the land seemed to promise. Then she saw him. Jacob stood on the porch of the main house, tall and broad-shouldered, his dark hair slightly tousled by the wind. He watched her with quiet intensity, arms crossed over his chest, his face unreadable. There was a calm authority in the way he held himself, as if the ranch itself bent to his will. Yet his eyes, sharp, steady, and perceptive, seemed to look straight through her, measuring and understanding more than mere appearances. Eliza's heart quickened. She had expected indifference or perhaps coldness, but what she saw instead was a presence that commanded attention without needing to raise a hand or voice. "Miss Eliza?" His voice was low, even, and carried the kind of control that made people listen without resistance. "Yes," she replied, straightening her shoulders, her voice firmer than she felt. She refused to show the tremor of nerves that ran through her. "I'm Eliza." Jacob nodded once, almost imperceptibly, and stepped forward. "Welcome to the ranch. I trust your journey wasn't unpleasant?" There was a faint hint of curiosity in his tone, but no judgment. It was a simple, practical question, yet Eliza sensed something more. A quiet acknowledgement that her past struggles mattered less here than her presence now. She glanced down at the suitcase in her hands, then back at him. "It was long," she admitted, keeping her voice even. "But I am capable of handling myself." Jacob's eyes flickered with something like approval, though his expression remained composed. "I would hope so. There is much work to be done, and the ranch requires hands that are steady and willing." He gestured toward the main house. "Come inside. You'll need food and rest before you see the rest of the property." Eliza followed him, taking in every detail: the sturdy beams of the porch, the worn wooden steps, the smell of fresh bread baking somewhere inside. The house was functional, not ornate, yet there was a warmth to it that felt deliberate, as if someone had built it with thought and care rather than just necessity. Inside, Jacob offered her a seat at a simple wooden table. "You may be here under unusual circumstances," he said, his gaze meeting hers. "But I want to make one thing clear. I do not measure a person by what they can produce for me. I expect honesty, diligence, and respect. Everything else is irrelevant." Eliza blinked, surprised. The words were unexpected. Most men she had known, especially her family, had always judged her by narrow, rigid standards. Yet here was a man, a stranger, asserting that her worth was not tied to her ability to meet someone else's expectations. It stirred something cautiously hopeful inside her, though she masked it behind a polite nod. "I understand," she said softly, her fingers tightening slightly around the edge of the table. Jacob's lips twitched, almost a smile. "Good. Then we begin as equals. I will teach you what you need to know about the ranch. You will work hard, but you will not be treated as less than any other person here." Eliza let the words sink in. For the first time since her family had cast her aside, she felt the possibility of dignity, of respect, and maybe even trust. She did not know what the future held, nor could she imagine the bond that might grow between them. But in that moment, she realized that her journey was no longer simply about surviving. It was about finding a place where she could belong on her own terms. Jacob stood, signaling the end of their first meeting. Rest now. "Tomorrow, we begin properly." Eliza rose, smoothing her skirts, and followed him with a quiet determination. The fear that had accompanied her journey so far had not vanished, but it had softened, replaced by something unfamiliar yet tantalizing. The first hint of hope, and perhaps the first glimpse of trust. The morning sun spilled across the ranch, golden and relentless, as Eliza stepped out of the main house, ready for her first full day. She had been up before dawn, trying to anticipate what awaited her, and already the smell of hay, horses, and the warm earth filled her senses. The work ahead promised to be grueling, but for the first time, it wasn't the weight of judgment that drove her. It was curiosity, determination, and a quiet desire to prove to herself that she could endure and even thrive. Jacob was already outside, inspecting the horses with meticulous care. The sight of him hands deftly brushing down a chestnut stallion, eyes scanning the herd with unwavering focus filled her with both admiration and a trace of nervousness. She approached cautiously. "Good morning," she said softly. He looked up, his expression calm but assessing. "Morning. Ready to start?" Eliza nodded. Yes, I want to learn. Jacob gave a small nod of approval. Then we begin with the basics: feeding, grooming, checking the fences. You'll need to know the land as well as the livestock. Everything here relies on diligence and respect for the animals, for the land, and for each other. The day unfolded with exhausting intensity. Eliza mucked stalls, carried heavy feed bags, and learned to handle the stubborn horses under Jacob's careful guidance. At first, every movement felt awkward. Her hands were blistered, her back ached, and the sun burned down with unrelenting heat. Yet, with each task, she felt herself grow steadier, more confident. Jacob's instructions were clear and patient, his voice never condescending. When she struggled, he simply demonstrated the motion, letting her try again until she succeeded. By midday, the two worked side by side, their conversation sparse but meaningful. Jacob offered tips on handling the animals and maintaining the fences, but also asked questions, simple ones about her life, her past, her interests. Eliza found herself answering cautiously at first, but gradually the conversation flowed with a natural rhythm. She discovered that he wasn't the stoic, untouchable man she had imagined. He was observant, thoughtful, and genuinely interested in her perspective. During a short break under the shade of an old oak tree, Jacob handed her a damp cloth. "You're doing well," he said simply, not as praise, but as an acknowledgement. It made her chest swell in a way she hadn't expected. She realized that, for the first time since leaving home, her efforts were appreciated on their own merit, not judged against some cruel standard of worth. As the day wore on, Eliza began to notice the rhythms of the ranch, the way the horses responded to her touch, how the fences needed to be walked carefully to catch loose boards, the way the morning light shifted across the fields, revealing hidden hollows and wildflowers. She found herself enjoying the physicality of the work, the tangible results of her labor, and the quiet satisfaction of being trusted to do it correctly. Jacob watched her from time to time, his eyes scanning her movements. There was no impatience, no pressure, only a steady presence that somehow made her feel safer and more capable. And slowly, an unspoken bond began to form between them, not born of words, but of shared effort, mutual respect, and a recognition of each other's strength. By the time the sun began its descent, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, Eliza's body was weary, but her spirit was alight. She realized that she had survived the day, yes, but more importantly, she had begun to belong somewhere. This ranch, this rugged expanse of land, and the quiet man who ran it were becoming a place where she could carve out a life for herself. That evening, as she cleaned herself up and prepared a simple meal, she found herself reflecting on the contrast between this world and the one she had left behind. On the ranch, she was valued not for what she could give, but for what she was capable, willing, and alive. And as she glanced toward Jacob, quietly checking the last of the stables, she realized that perhaps this place and this man were offering her something she hadn't dared hope for, not just survival, but respect, companionship, and the faintest hint of trust. Days on the ranch had settled into a rhythm, and with each passing sunrise, Eliza found herself growing more comfortable in her new life. She still carried the weight of her past, the sting of her family's betrayal, but the harsh, dusty land seemed to wash some of it away with every sunrise and every task completed. She had learned the schedules, the chores, and the needs of the animals, yet it was the quiet moments with Jacob that began to unsettle her heart in ways she hadn't anticipated. It was a late afternoon when it happened first, an ordinary moment that carried extraordinary weight. They were mending a fence together along the eastern pasture, the sun slanting through the trees, casting long shadows over the golden grass. Eliza worked the hammer, fitting boards into place, while Jacob steadied the posts and measured the spacing with a careful, practiced eye. They worked in silence for a time, the only sounds the creak of wood and the occasional chirp of birds in the distance. Then Jacob spoke almost as an afterthought. "You've got a natural rhythm with your hands." "I didn't expect it." Eliza looked up, surprised by the remark. I suppose I've had practice," she replied, her cheeks warming slightly. She wasn't used to praise, and certainly not in a tone so casual yet sincere. Jacob's eyes flicked toward her briefly, then back to his work. "It shows. Most people either rush or hesitate. You find the middle ground," she blinked, unsure how to respond. Yet a small smile tugged at her lips, and for a fleeting moment she felt lighter, as if the invisible chains of judgment had loosened, replaced by acknowledgment. There was no obligation in his words, no expectation, only recognition, a rare gift for someone who had spent her life being told she was not enough. The days that followed were filled with similar small exchanges, Jacob asking her opinion on which pasture to clear first, Eliza joking lightly when he insisted she lift heavier feed sacks than she could comfortably manage, both of them laughing softly when the animals behaved unpredictably. Each shared glance, each brief smile, carried with it a quiet understanding. They were discovering each other slowly, not through forced conversation or societal expectation, but through the simple, shared act of living and working side by side. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, painting the sky in shades of violet and gold, they paused at the edge of the creek that ran through the ranch. Jacob knelt, washing a stubborn cut on one of the horse's legs, and Eliza knelt beside him, handing him the cloth. Their hands brushed, accidental at first, then lingered for a heartbeat longer than necessary. Jacob looked up at her then, his eyes catching the fading light. "You're patient," he said softly, almost to himself. "I appreciate that." Eliza's heart fluttered. She wanted to speak, to respond with something clever or witty, but found herself simply nodding. "I've had to be," she murmured, her gaze dropping to the creek water. It was in these small, almost imperceptible moments that their connection deepened. Neither needed to voice it outright. There was no grand declaration yet, only the tension of shared time, the quiet comfort in each other's presence, and the slow recognition that they enjoyed the company of one another. A fleeting glance across a field, a hand reaching to steady a ladder, a shared laugh at a clumsy horse, these moments began to weave an invisible thread between them. That night, as Eliza lay in the small guest room the ranch had set aside for her, she thought of the day. Her body was exhausted, yes, but her mind refused to rest. The awareness of Jacob's quiet attentions lingered, and with it came something entirely new. The faint, thrilling sense that she might matter to someone again, not because of what she could give, but because of who she was. And somewhere across the house in his study, Jacob sat alone as well, quietly reflecting on her presence. He did not fully understand it himself, but there was a pull he could not ignore, a subtle warmth when she was near, a growing appreciation for her mind, her hands, her steady courage. The beginnings of something unspoken had taken root between them, fragile yet undeniable, promising that the days ahead would be more than work. They might slowly become shared life. The peaceful rhythm of ranch life was abruptly disrupted one morning when a rider appeared over the hill, galloping at full speed toward the main house. Eliza, tending to the morning chores, froze as the rider drew near. He carried a letter sealed with her family's unmistakable mark. Her stomach tightened. She knew this meant trouble. The letter was delivered directly into Jacob's hands, and he broke the seal with deliberate calm, scanning its contents quickly. Eliza approached cautiously. "What is it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jacob's face remained neutral, though his jaw tightened slightly. "A message from your family," he said. "They have opinions about your stay here." He handed the letter to her. Eliza took it with trembling hands, unfolding the paper to read the harsh words penned in familiar, accusing script. Her father demanded her immediate return, insisting she had been wrongly led astray and threatening disgrace if she refused. The old guilt and shame pressed down on her chest like a heavy weight, and for a moment she felt herself shrinking. Remembering the years of judgment that had driven her away, Jacob's presence beside her was steady, grounding. He saw her flinch at the words and laid a firm hand on her shoulder. "Ignore them," he said quietly, yet with authority. "This is not your home, nor your life. You belong here if you wish it." Eliza looked up at him, startled. "But they will make trouble. They could ruin everything here." Jacob's dark eyes held hers unwaveringly. "They will not. I will not allow it. You are under my protection while you are here. Your worth is not defined by their opinion, nor by the past they cling to. You are capable, strong, and valued for who you are, not for what they think you should be." The words struck her with a mix of relief and disbelief. For so long, she had been told that her only value was tied to her ability to fulfill a role she could not meet. Here was a man, a stranger at first, insisting that she mattered simply because of herself. It was revolutionary. It was terrifying. And it was a comfort unlike any she had ever known. Her father's threats and insults had no power in the face of Jacob's unwavering support. "But I don't know if I can," she began, uncertainty creeping into her voice. "You can," Jacob interrupted firmly, his hand still resting lightly on her shoulder. "And you will. We will face them together if it comes to that. You are not alone anymore. And I will not allow anyone to dictate your worth but you." Over the next days, rumors began to circulate in the nearby town. Gossiping neighbors whispered about the young woman the widowed rancher had taken in. They questioned her reputation, spoke of scandal, and tried to stir old prejudices. But Jacob met each insinuation with quiet firmness. When neighbors came asking pointed questions or trying to insinuate judgment, he simply reminded them, "She is under my care, and her worth is her own. I suggest you respect that, or you will find yourself unwelcome here." Eliza watched this unfold with a mixture of awe and gratitude. It was one thing to hear words of encouragement. It was another to witness them enacted, to see someone not only believe in her value but to defend it fiercely against the world. Slowly, she felt the layers of doubt and shame begin to peel away, replaced with a cautious confidence. For the first time, she realized that the past did not have to define her. She could exist here, in this space of respect and trust, free from the constant shadow of her family's condemnation. That night, as the ranch settled into quiet, she found herself reflecting on Jacob's unwavering support. She thought of the simple courage it took to stand against her father and the townsfolk, to assert her value in a world that had long denied it. And in that reflection, she realized something she had not dared to hope, that the man beside her was not only a protector, but a partner in the truest sense, a person who saw her fully and demanded nothing but honesty in return. For the first time in years, Eliza felt a flicker of unshakable hope. Not because her past had changed, but because she had found someone who refused to let it control her future. The evening settled over the ranch like a soft blanket, the sky painted in streaks of purple and gold. The day's labor had left both Eliza and Jacob weary, their bodies aching from chores and long walks across the fields. But exhaustion did not dampen the quiet tension that lingered between them, a tension born of curiosity, respect, and an unspoken need for connection. That night, the ranch felt unusually intimate, as if the very walls were conspiring to allow a space where truths could finally be spoken. Eliza sat on the porch steps, rocking gently in the chair Jacob had insisted she use, while he leaned against the railing, a mug of coffee warming his hands. For a long time, neither spoke. The soft sounds of the ranch, the distant lowing of cattle, the rustle of leaves in the breeze, the occasional creak of the barn doors filled the silence. It was comfortable, yet charged, the kind of silence that invites honesty. Finally, Jacob broke the quiet, his voice low and careful. "I don't talk much about myself," he said, eyes fixed on the horizon. Most people don't care to know. But you seem different. Eliza's heart skipped. She had sensed this moment might come, the opening of a door she hadn't known could exist. Different how? She asked, her voice soft, almost tentative. Jacob's gaze flicked to her, and for the first time she saw a flicker of vulnerability in his otherwise stoic expression. I lost my wife. Years ago. And our child, he admitted quietly, his words clipped, as though the act of saying them made them real. I've been alone since. It's harder than I thought it would be. Eliza's breath caught in her throat. She had expected a man of strength and authority, perhaps a touch of mystery, but never this raw honesty. Something stirred within her, a recognition of shared pain, a mirror to her own history of loss and rejection. Tentatively, she found her own voice. I understand more than you might think, she said, her eyes searching his. I've been discarded by my own family, told I am not enough. She paused, swallowing the bitter taste of old shame. They tried to sell me like I was nothing. Jacob's expression softened, and he moved slightly closer, though still at a respectful distance. I cannot imagine what that must feel like, he said quietly, but I do know that you are not nothing, and you will not be treated that way here. Not while I have any say in it. Eliza's throat tightened, and for a moment she felt tears prick her eyes. But they were not the tears of sorrow, they were the tears of release, of recognition, of connection. Here was someone who saw her pain and refused to let it define her. Someone who did not judge her for her past, for her supposed inadequacies, for the labels her family had forced upon her. They sat in silence again, but this time it was a silence full of meaning. Words were unnecessary. The honesty shared between them bridged a gap neither had dared to cross before. Slowly, the emotional walls each had built around themselves began to crumble, brick by brick. Eliza felt the tight grip of shame loosen, and Jacob allowed himself to acknowledge a loneliness he had long carried in isolation. Eventually, Jacob spoke again, softer now, almost a whisper. I didn't expect to find someone who understands me. Not like this. You make it easier to face the past, even if only a little. Eliza tilted her head, a small, shy smile tugging at her lips. And you make it easier to believe that I might belong somewhere, that I might matter, not because of what I can give, but because I am. For the first time, they allowed themselves to meet each other fully, not just as rancher and newcomer, or protector and ward, but as two people who had known loss, pain, and judgment, and were now discovering that trust, understanding, and connection were possible. In the quiet of the porch, under the fading light, a bond began to form that neither could ignore. It was fragile, tender, and precious, yet it held the promise of something enduring. Love born not from necessity or obligation, but from shared vulnerability and mutual respect. As the stars began to sprinkle the sky above, Eliza leaned back, feeling for the first time that she was not alone, and Jacob allowed himself to hope that perhaps, at long last, he had found someone who could see him, truly see him, and choose to stay. The calm that had settled over the ranch was shattered one gray morning when a cloud of dust appeared on the horizon. Eliza, gathering eggs in the henhouse, froze as she recognized the unmistakable silhouettes of her father and brothers riding with grim determination. Her heart pounded violently, a mix of fear, anger, and dread tightening its grip. She had hoped that distance and her life on the ranch would keep him at bay. But they had come not with apologies, but with demands and threats. Jacob, who had been checking the fences nearby, noticed her sudden tension and approached quickly. "What is it?" he asked, his voice calm but alert. Eliza's hands trembled as she pointed toward the approaching riders. "It's them. My family. They're coming here." Jacob's jaw tightened, and his posture straightened into an unyielding line of authority. "They will not dictate your life," he said firmly. "Not here, not ever. Stay behind me." As the riders drew closer, their intentions became clear. They shouted her name, demanding her return, their voices laced with rage and entitlement. Townsfolk who had gathered along the road whispered behind them, some curious, some eager to witness a scandal. But Jacob did not flinch. He rode forward, intercepting the group with a measured calm that belied the tension crackling in the air. "Eliza is under my protection," Jacob announced, his voice carrying across the open fields. "She will not return with you. You have no claim over her life, her choices, or her future." Her father's face turned red with fury. "You have no right. She is our daughter. You cannot keep her from us." Jacob's gaze was steady and unyielding. "I do not need to justify my actions to you. She has chosen to stay here, and I will ensure her safety. If you attempt to force her to leave, you will do so over my objections, and you will regret it." Eliza watched in awe, her fear gradually giving way to a rising sense of security and gratitude. She had never experienced someone standing so completely in her corner, refusing to let her past define her present. The courage Jacob displayed, the sheer force of his conviction, created a protective barrier around her that she had never known existed. Her brothers tried to argue, to threaten, to shame him, but Jacob's presence was like an unmovable rock. He didn't shout, he didn't insult. They could see in his eyes and hear in his voice that his patience had limits, and those limits were absolute. "Leave now," he said quietly but firmly, "and do not return unless it is to treat her with the respect she deserves." Faced with the unyielding authority of a man who clearly meant every word, her father and brothers had no choice but to retreat. The townsfolk whispered among themselves, sensing the shift of power, the unusual sight of a young woman defended so completely against her own family. Eliza's father shot one last venomous glance before spurring his horse and retreating, but the damage had already been done not to her, but to the illusion that he could control her life. After the dust settled, Eliza turned to Jacob, her eyes shining with a mixture of relief and admiration. You didn't have to do that," she said softly, almost in disbelief. Jacob shrugged lightly, though his eyes remained serious. "I did. You are not property. You are not defined by their opinions or their threats. You belong here if you choose to belong. And I will ensure that nothing from your past harms you again." For the first time, Eliza truly understood the depth of his care, not just respect, not just admiration, but unwavering protection. The bond between them, already fragile and tentative, now had the weight of trust and security behind it. She realized that whatever challenges lay ahead, she would no longer face them alone. Jacob had made it clear that she was seen, valued, and defended, and in that she found a courage and strength she had not known she possessed. That evening, as the sun sank behind the hills and the ranch returned to quiet, Eliza allowed herself a small, private smile. The storm of her past had reached her doorstep, and yet she had not been broken. For the first time, she felt fully rooted in a place that was hers, protected, respected, and no longer defined by the cruelty of those who had cast her aside. The ranch was bathed in the soft glow of early evening, the air carrying the scent of warm hay, earth, and the lingering fragrance of wildflowers that dotted the fields. Eliza stood at the edge of the pasture, brushing down one of the horses, her thoughts drifting despite the rhythm of her work. The events of the past weeks, the journey, the labor, the threats, and the quiet moments of connection had left her feeling something she had not dared feel in years: hope. Jacob approached, his steps silent against the grass. She didn't look up immediately, yet she sensed him, as always, with an instinct sharpened by familiarity. "The horses are fed?" he asked, his voice calm, carrying the authority of someone who always knew what needed to be done. "They are," Eliza replied softly, straightening and dusting her hands on her skirts. She finally met his gaze, and for the first time she allowed herself to really see him, not just as her protector, her mentor in ranch work, or the man who had defended her from her past, but as a person who had become essential to her life in ways she hadn't anticipated. Jacob's eyes held a quiet intensity, different from the professional or guarded look he usually reserved. "You've grown accustomed to life here," he said, almost as a statement rather than a question. "To the work." "To the land." Eliza smiled faintly. "I have. It's not what I expected, but it feels like something I can belong to." Her voice wavered slightly as the truth settled on her heart. She had never felt this sense of peace, this sense of being truly seen and valued in all her life. Jacob stepped closer, his presence warm and steady. "And to me?" His voice carried a subtle weight, as though testing the waters of something deeper. Eliza's heart quickened. She had felt the pull between them growing steadily over the weeks, the quiet glances, the shared laughter, the accidental touches that lingered just long enough to be noticed. She swallowed, realizing that she could no longer deny the truth to herself. "To you," she said softly, her voice almost a whisper, I care more than I should admit." For a moment, Jacob said nothing, simply observing her with a tenderness that made her breath catch. Then he reached out, a tentative hand hovering near hers before gently brushing her fingers. "I feel the same," he admitted, his voice low and steady. "I never expected to feel this again. But you've shown me that companionship, respect, and trust can grow into something more. Something real." Eliza's chest tightened with emotion, the walls she had built around her heart slowly crumbling. She realized that her love for Jacob wasn't born of gratitude alone, it was admiration, respect, and a quiet joy she hadn't dared hope for. Her past, her family's cruelty, her own fears, they mattered less now than the truth she could not deny. She had found someone who saw her fully, who valued her for her mind, her spirit, and her courage. Jacob stepped closer, bridging the small distance between them. "I don't need you to bear children, Eliza," he said softly, echoing words he had once spoken to reassure her. "I need you because of who you are, because you're here, and because you choose to be." Tears pricked at the corners of her eyes, a mixture of relief, joy, and the release of years of unspoken pain. She nodded, letting herself lean into him slightly, feeling the solid strength of his presence. "And I choose to be," she whispered, her voice steady despite the tremor in her heart. The world around them seemed to pause, the horses grazing silently, the sun dipping low over the hills, the breeze carrying the scent of earth and wildflowers. In that quiet, fragile moment, Eliza and Jacob recognized the love that had been quietly growing between them, nurtured by respect, trust, and shared vulnerability. It was not a sudden, fiery passion, but a steady, enduring flame, one that promised to endure, to grow, and to carry them forward together. As the first stars began to shimmer in the twilight sky, Eliza felt an overwhelming sense of belonging, not just on the ranch, not just beside Jacob, but within herself. She had survived betrayal, shame, and fear, and in doing so, she had found a love that was both liberating and profound. And in Jacob's steady gaze, she knew, without doubt, that she had found a partner for life, a man who saw her, valued her, and loved her just as she was. The ranch was alive with the gentle rhythm of morning, the lowing of cattle, the distant clatter of hooves, and the soft whisper of the wind through the fields. Eliza moved through it with a sense of ease she had never known before, her hands steady as she carried water to the horses and checked the fences. The work was hard, but it was hers, and she had grown into it with a confidence that surprised even her. No longer was she the timid, discarded girl who had been sold by her family. She was a woman who had claimed her place, her dignity, and her life. Jacob emerged from the house, a wide-brimmed hat shading his face, and caught her eye. A small, knowing smile tugged at the corners of his lips. "Breakfast is ready," he called, his voice carrying across the yard. He moved toward her, each step sure and steady, and she felt the warmth of his presence settle over her like a protective cloak. Eliza returned the smile, feeling a sense of contentment she had never experienced before. Together they walked toward the house, side by side, their hands brushing occasionally, each touch a quiet affirmation of their connection. The bond they had nurtured over weeks of labor, vulnerability, and shared struggles had grown into something undeniable, a partnership rooted in respect, trust, and love. Inside the kitchen, the smell of fresh bread and sizzling bacon filled the air. Eliza set the table while Jacob poured coffee, the simple domesticity of the moment a stark contrast to the turmoil she had endured in the past. She caught herself thinking about the family that had tried to define her worth, tried to discard her like a piece of property. And then she thought of Jacob, of the unwavering support he had offered, and of the life they were building together. The comparison was stark, almost painful, but it also reminded her of how far she had come. As they sat to eat, their conversation was easy, flowing naturally from the tasks of the day to small jokes and shared observations. Laughter echoed through the kitchen, and for Eliza, it was a sound that signified freedom, a freedom from shame, from judgment, and from the limitations her family had imposed. After breakfast, they stepped outside, and Jacob guided her toward the fields. "Today, we're starting on the north pasture," he said, his hand briefly brushing hers as he passed her the tools. "It's a big task, but together we can handle it." Eliza nodded, feeling a surge of determination. "Together," she repeated, savoring the word. It was no longer just a statement of companionship, it was a promise, a declaration that they would face life's challenges side by side. As they worked, the sun climbed higher, casting its warm light across the land. Eliza paused for a moment, taking in the vastness of the ranch, the rolling hills, and the horizon that stretched endlessly before her. For the first time, the future felt open, filled with possibility rather than fear. She realized that she was no longer defined by her past, by the cruelty of her family, or by societal expectations. She was her own person, strong, capable, and loved for who she was. Jacob looked over at her, noticing the quiet joy in her expression, and his chest swelled with a deep protective affection. "You belong here," he said simply, his voice steady. "And not just on this land, you belong with me. Always." Eliza's eyes glistened, and she reached out to take his hand, feeling the warmth and strength of his grip. "And I choose to be here," she replied softly, "with you. In this life we're building." The days that followed were filled with work, laughter, and small moments of tenderness. Eliza and Jacob forged a life together that was both simple and profound, a life rooted in love, trust, and mutual respect. The ranch, once a vast and daunting expanse, became a home, a symbol of freedom, resilience, and the life they had chosen to create together. As the sun dipped below the hills that evening, casting the sky in hues of gold and amber, Eliza stood beside Jacob on the porch, watching the land stretch out before them. For the first time, she felt fully at peace. She had endured shame, betrayal, and fear, and she had emerged stronger, cherished, and loved. Their hands intertwined, and she leaned into him, feeling the steady rhythm of his presence. In that quiet, perfect moment, they both understood that life, with all its challenges and uncertainties, was brighter and richer when faced together. And as the stars began to shimmer above the ranch, Eliza knew, with unshakable certainty, that this was her home, her love, and her new beginning.